The wounded cowboy tried to stitch himself beneath the merciless desert sun, blood pooling in the sand around his trembling hands, until the mysterious black bride appeared from nowhere, took the needle, and said, "You missed a spot." Townspeople whisper she's cursed. A wandering woman whose dark presence brings misfortune wherever her feet touch ground. They expect her to fade into servitude and silence, another forgotten soul crushed by an unforgiving frontier. But the desperate drifter bleeding in her steady hands carries secrets that could destroy the very men who profit from keeping folks like her powerless. Her hidden knowledge could save a dying community, while his burden holds the key to exposing those who ensure suffering continues. Will two outcasts survive long enough to reveal the truth that threatens everything, or will the powerful silence them both before justice sees daylight? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The Arizona Territory sun beat down mercilessly on Copper Ridge, a mining town where dust and desperation hung thick in the air. Black smoke poured from the mines while men emerged covered in soot and exhaustion. The sound of pickaxes echoed through narrow streets lined with ramshackle buildings and broken dreams. Ada Holston walked through the main street carrying a worn leather bag. Townspeople stepped aside, their whispers following her like shadows. The preacher's wife clutched her children closer. The general store owner spat into the dirt as she passed. "That woman brings nothing but trouble," muttered Mrs. Henderson to her neighbor. "Every town she visits, something terrible happens." Ada kept walking, her spine straight, her eyes forward. She had heard worse in Denver, in Santa Fe, in every settlement between here and the Mississippi. The weight of their stares meant nothing compared to the weight in her medical bag. Sheriff Cornelius Wade leaned against the saloon post, his badge catching the sunlight. His eyes tracked Ada's movement with the patience of a predator. Dr. Marcus Finch stumbled out of the same saloon, reeking of whiskey at 2 in the afternoon. "Sheriff," Finch slurred, "you gonna let that woman practice her voodoo in our town?" Wade smiled without warmth. "She ain't practicing nothing official, just folk remedies, right?" His tone suggested Ada had better keep it that way. Ada found lodging at the boarding house on the edge of town. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly proprietor, needed the money more than she feared the rumors. The room was small, clean, and overlooked the mining operations where accidents happened weekly. 3 miles outside town, James Thatcher pressed his back against sun-baked rocks. Blood seeped through his shirt from a deep gash across his shoulder. His hands shook as he threaded a needle, sweat dripping onto the crude medical supplies he had stolen from a frontier doctor's wagon. The posse had given up the chase hours ago, but James knew they would return. Sheriff Wade wanted him back in chains, wanted the leather satchel full of money that James carried. Money that belonged to him by right, though no court would listen to a drifter's claim against a dead rancher's estate. James pushed the needle through his skin. He bit down hard, tasting copper and dust. The stitches were uneven, pulling tight in some places and loose in others. Blood continued to seep through the gaps. A shadow fell across him. Ada stood silently, studying his handiwork with the clinical eye of someone who had seen far worse. She set down her medical bag and knelt beside him. "You missed a spot," she said, taking the needle from his trembling fingers. James tried to pull away, but weakness had settled into his bones. "I don't need help from nobody." Ada ignored him. Her hands moved with precision, cleaning the wound properly before beginning new stitches. Each movement was deliberate, professional. James watched her work, noting how different her technique was from his desperate attempts. "You know medicine," he said. "I know enough." Ada's voice carried no pride, just fact. She finished the stitching and applied a proper bandage. The bleeding stopped completely. James flexed his shoulder experimentally and felt no pulling or tearing. "Why help me?" Ada packed her instruments away. "Everyone deserves proper healing." James studied her face. There was intelligence there, education that went far beyond frontier remedies. Her hands were steady as a surgeon's, her knowledge deeper than any traveling healer should possess. "You're running from something too," he said. Ada stood and brushed dust from her skirts. "We're all running from something out here." Back in town, miner Tom Rodriguez carried his injured son into Dr. Finch's office. The boy had caught his hand in machinery, 3 fingers crushed and bleeding. Finch examined the wound through bleary eyes and reached for his bottle. "Gonna have to take the whole hand," Finch declared. "Infection's sure to set in otherwise." Tom's wife began crying. The boy was only 12 years old. Ada heard the commotion from the boarding house. She watched through her window as other mining families gathered outside Finch's office, their faces grim with familiar resignation. This was how it always went in towns like Copper Ridge. People suffered because those in power profited from their suffering. That evening, Ada walked to the Rodriguez home. She knocked softly and waited. Tom answered, his eyes red with exhaustion and grief. "I might be able to help your son," Ada said quietly, "if you're willing to trust me." Tom looked back at his family, then at Ada. "Doc Finch says the hand's got to come off." "Dr. Finch has been drinking since noon," Ada replied. "I have different ideas." Hope flickered in Tom's eyes. Dangerous hope that could get them all in trouble with Sheriff Wade and the town's established order. But his son's future hung in the balance. He opened the door wider. Ada entered the Rodriguez home and examined the boy's mangled fingers by lamplight. The damage was severe, but not hopeless. With proper care, surgical precision, and antibiotics, she could save the hand. She had saved worse during her residency in Washington. But saving this boy's hand would mean revealing abilities that went far beyond what people expected from a wandering black woman. It would mean painting a target on her back in yet another town. It would mean risking everything she had worked to build. The boy looked up at her with trust she had not earned but desperately wanted to deserve. Ada opened her medical bag and began laying out instruments that belonged in a proper hospital, not a miner's kitchen. Each tool represented years of study, sacrifice, and determination that the world refused to acknowledge. Outside, Sheriff Wade made his evening rounds, unaware that the foundation of his carefully constructed order was about to crumble. Ada worked through the night in the Rodriguez kitchen. Her surgical instruments gleamed under the lamplight as she carefully reconstructed the boy's crushed fingers. Each suture was precise, each movement deliberate. She had performed this same procedure during her residency at Howard University, saving the hand of a factory worker who had suffered similar injuries. Tom and his wife, Maria, watched in stunned silence. They had expected folk remedies and prayers. Instead, they witnessed surgery that belonged in the finest hospitals back east. "Hold the lamp steady," Ada instructed Maria. Her voice carried the authority of years spent in operating rooms where hesitation meant death. By dawn, the boy's hand was bandaged and splinted. Ada left detailed instructions for care and cleaning. She also left behind enough proper medicine to prevent infection. "Tell no one exactly what I did here," Ada said as she packed her instruments. "For all our safety." Tom nodded, understanding the delicate position they all occupied. In a town where Dr. Finch's incompetence was protected by Sheriff Wade's authority, Ada's competence posed a threat to the established order. Word spread quietly through the mining community anyway. The Rodriguez boy kept his hand. His fingers would heal properly. Other families began to take notice. James returned to town 3 days later, his shoulder healing cleanly under Ada's expert stitching. He found lodging at the same boarding house and began observing the strange dynamics of Copper Ridge. Mrs. Patterson mentioned how the Rodriguez boy was recovering miraculously. The general store owner complained about mining families suddenly needing fewer bandages and pain tonics. Even the undertaker seemed puzzled by the recent decrease in business. James connected the patterns to Ada's nighttime visits. She was treating people secretly, using skills that went far beyond anything he had witnessed on the frontier. He found her tending to a miner's infected leg wound behind the boarding house. The man lay on a makeshift table while Ada cleaned the injury with surgical precision. The infection that should have cost him the limb was already retreating under proper medical care. "You're a real doctor," James said after the miner left. Ada continued cleaning her instruments. "I'm whatever people need me to be." "That's not an answer." Ada looked up at him. The pretense fell away from her face, revealing the exhaustion of someone who had spent years hiding her true self. "Howard University Medical School. Class of 1884, she said. Top of my class, 6 years of study, 2 years of residency. All worthless the moment I try to hang a shingle anywhere in this country. James understood now why she moved from town to town, never staying long enough to establish roots. A black woman with medical credentials threatened too many people who profited from ignorance and desperation. Why not go back east? Because people are dying out here, Ada replied. In Boston, they have other doctors. Out here they have Dr. Finch. As if summoned by his name, Finch appeared around the corner of the building. He had been drinking, but his eyes were sharp with suspicion. What's going on back here? Ada stepped forward calmly. Just helping with some household remedies, doctor. Finch studied the medical instruments she was putting away. His face reddened with more than alcohol. Those look mighty professional for household remedies. My grandmother was skilled with healing, Ada replied smoothly. She taught me well. Finch wanted to challenge her further, but Sheriff Wade's voice called from the street. The doctor stumbled away, muttering threats under his breath. He's going to cause trouble, James warned. He already is trouble, Ada replied. The question is whether we can do enough good before he stops us. Over the following weeks, Ada's secret practice expanded. Miners brought their families to her under cover of darkness. She treated infected wounds that Finch had declared hopeless. She saved a woman's life during a difficult childbirth that the official doctor had abandoned. She set bones properly instead of leaving them to heal crooked. James became her unofficial assistant and protector. His knowledge of frontier survival complemented her medical expertise. He had learned basic wound care, helping his father treat injured ranch hands during cattle drives. More importantly, he provided security during her nighttime treatments. My father was an honest rancher, James told her one evening as they walked between patients. Built his spread from nothing, never cheated nobody. When the cattle barons tried to run him off, he stood his ground. What happened to him? They framed him for rustling, murdered him before he could clear his name. That money I'm carrying was hidden in his cabin. My inheritance, legally speaking. But try explaining that to Sheriff Wade. Ada understood. They were both victims of systems designed to keep certain people powerless. Her education meant nothing if society refused to recognize it. His rightful inheritance was worthless if the law would not protect it. The mining families began calling her Dr. Ada in whispered conversations. Children who should have died from fever recovered completely. Men who should have lost limbs to infection kept working. Women who should have bled to death during childbirth lived to raise their babies. Sheriff Wade noticed the changes. Fewer funerals meant less profit for the undertaker who paid him monthly bribes. Healthier miners meant stronger workers who might demand better conditions. Dr. Finch complained constantly about families who no longer sought his expensive, ineffective treatments. The power structure of Copper Ridge was beginning to crack. Ada's competence was exposing years of deliberate neglect and exploitation. One evening, as Ada finished treating a child's pneumonia that Finch had declared fatal, she looked up to find James watching her with something approaching awe. "You're not just saving lives," he said. "You're changing this whole place." Ada packed away her stethoscope, a graduation gift she had never been able to use openly. "Change is dangerous," she replied, "especially when powerful people profit from the way things are." Neither of them knew that Sheriff Wade was already planning to end her practice permanently. The mine collapse happened at dawn on Tuesday. The mountain shuddered as support beams cracked deep underground. 12 miners were trapped in the lower tunnel, their screams echoing through tons of fallen rock and twisted metal. Tom Rodriguez ran through the streets, shouting for help. His voice cracked with panic as he banged on doors and windows. Other mining families poured from their homes, women clutching shawls and children rubbing sleep from their eyes. Sheriff Wade arrived first, surveying the chaos with calculated indifference. The mine entrance was blocked by massive boulders. Dust hung in the air like a funeral shroud. "Get Dr. Finch," Wade ordered his deputy. They found Finch passed out behind the saloon, empty bottles scattered around him like broken promises. When they finally roused him, he could barely stand upright. His hands shook so violently he could not hold his medical bag steady. "Gonna need time to sober up," Finch slurred, leaning against a hitching post. "We don't have time," Tom Rodriguez pleaded. "My brother's down there bleeding." Finch attempted to examine his own medical supplies and dropped them in the dirt. Glass vials shattered, bandages scattered in the wind. "Can't help nobody like this," he admitted, stumbling back toward the saloon. The mining families watched their official doctor abandon them in their darkest hour. Children cried while mothers prayed. Men who spent their lives underground knew exactly what internal injuries meant in the darkness below. Maria Rodriguez grabbed Ada's arm as she approached the crowd. "Dr. Ada," she whispered urgently, "you have to help them." Ada stood at the edge of the gathering, her medical bag heavy in her hand. Every instinct screamed at her to act. Years of training demanded she respond to the crisis, but revealing her true abilities publicly would destroy the careful balance that kept her safe. Sheriff Wade noticed her presence. His eyes narrowed with suspicion and opportunity. "You got any of those folk remedies that might help?" he asked loudly, his tone mocking. The crowd turned toward Ada. Desperate faces looked to her with hope they could not afford. She could see the internal debate playing out in their expressions. Trust the educated black woman or watch their loved ones die. Ada made her choice. She pushed through the crowd and knelt beside the first injured miner who had been pulled from the rubble. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, bone protruding through torn flesh. Blood pooled beneath him in the dirt. "I need boiling water, clean cloth, and a flat surface," she commanded with the authority of someone accustomed to emergency rooms. James appeared beside her, having heard the commotion from across town. He began organizing the crowd without being asked, his experience with ranch emergencies taking over. "You heard her," James shouted. "Move!" Ada opened her medical bag and withdrew surgical instruments that gleamed with professional precision. The crowd fell silent as she laid out tools that belonged in hospitals, not frontier mining camps. She worked on the first miner with movements that spoke of years spent in operating theaters. Her hands never hesitated as she cleaned the wound, realigned the broken bone, and began suturing with mathematical precision. "Hold his shoulders," she instructed James. "Keep him still." The second injured miner was carried up, his breathing shallow from internal trauma. Ada listened to his chest with her stethoscope, palpated his abdomen, and diagnosed internal bleeding that would have been fatal under Dr. Finch's care. She had performed this same procedure during her residency when a construction accident brought 6 workers to Howard University's hospital. The attending physician had praised her steady hands and quick thinking. Now those same skills were being displayed in the dust and chaos of a mining disaster. Ada worked through the morning as more injured men were pulled from the collapsed tunnel. She set bones with surgical precision. She sutured wounds that would have become infected under inferior care. She administered proper medications from her professional supplies. The crowd watched in amazement as she saved lives that everyone had assumed were lost. Her movements were confident, decisive. She never hesitated or second-guessed herself. This was not folk healing or lucky guesses. This was advanced medical training being applied with masterful skill. Sheriff Wade observed everything with growing alarm. Ada's competence was making Dr. Finch look like the incompetent drunk he was. More dangerous, her obvious medical expertise was raising questions about why the town tolerated such poor official care. By afternoon, all 12 miners had been treated. Ada had saved every life that Dr. Finch would have written off as hopeless. Men who should have died were sitting up and talking to their families. Wounds that should have festered were healing cleanly. The mining families gathered around Ada as she packed her instruments. Their whispered conversations were filled with awe and gratitude. Children who had watched their fathers nearly die now saw them recovering under proper medical care. "She's a real doctor," Maria Rodriguez said to her neighbors. "Trained at a real medical school back east." The secret was out. Ada's true qualifications could no longer be hidden behind folk remedy pretense. The entire town had witnessed surgical procedures that required years of formal education and hospital experience. Tom Rodriguez approached Ada as she cleaned her hands in a basin of water. "Thank you for saving my brother," he said simply. Ada nodded, knowing that her public revelation had changed everything. There would be no more secret treatments in the darkness, no more pretending to be just another traveling healer with mysterious remedies. Sheriff Wade pushed through the crowd, his face dark with anger and calculation. "Mighty impressive display," he said loudly, "for someone practicing medicine without a license in this territory." The threat hung in the air like smoke from the damaged mine. Ada had saved 12 lives, but she had also painted a target on her back that could not be erased. James moved closer to her, his hand resting on his gun belt. The battle lines were being drawn in the dust of Copper Ridge, and everyone knew the real fight was just beginning. Sheriff Wade arrested Ada at dawn the next morning. He kicked down the boarding house door while she was preparing medical supplies for her recovering patients. Mrs. Patterson protested weakly from the hallway, but Wade's badge carried more weight than her moral objections. "Ada Holston, you're under arrest for practicing medicine without a territorial license," Wade announced, enjoying the authority in his voice. Ada remained calm as he shackled her wrists. "My credentials are from Howard University Medical School. They're recognized in every territory." "Not by me," Wade replied. "And I'm the law here." The mining families gathered in the street as Wade paraded Ada toward the jail. Women clutched their children while men who owed their lives to her skill watched helplessly. Tom Rodriguez started forward, but his wife grabbed his arm. "They're looking for an excuse," Maria whispered urgently. "Don't give them one." Dr. Finch emerged from the saloon, swaying slightly but grinning with satisfaction. His bloodshot eyes followed Ada's progress with vindictive pleasure. "About time someone put that woman in her place," he called loudly. People were starting to get dangerous ideas about proper medical care. James watched from the boarding house window, his jaw tight with controlled rage. He understood the game being played. Ada's competence threatened the established order, so the system was moving to eliminate her. The jail cell was small and airless. Wade locked Ada inside with theatrical ceremony, making sure the gathered crowd could see her humiliation. But Ada's dignity remained intact. She sat calmly on the narrow cot, her medical training having prepared her for challenges far greater than frontier intimidation. "Trial's set for Friday," Wade announced. "Judge Morrison will be riding in from the territorial capital." James knew Judge Morrison by reputation. The man was honest, but bound by territorial law. If Wade could frame the charges properly, Ada would face immediate exile, or worse. That evening, James began his investigation. He started with the town's financial records, using skills learned from helping his father manage ranch accounts. The numbers told a disturbing story. Dr. Finch received payments far beyond what his medical services were worth. Sheriff Wade's income exceeded his official salary by suspicious amounts. Both men were connected financially to Harrison Blackwood, who owned the largest mine in the region. James dug deeper. He discovered a pattern that stretched back years. Towns where Ada had worked always experienced mysterious accidents shortly after her arrival. Fires, equipment failures, economic disasters that forced her to move on quickly. The accidents were not random. They were orchestrated. James found receipts hidden in Wade's office that revealed payments to men who traveled between mining towns. Professional troublemakers whose job was disrupting communities where certain people became too successful or influential. The conspiracy was larger than simple prejudice. Ada represented a threat to a system designed to keep mining communities desperate and dependent. Healthy workers demanded better conditions. Families with proper medical care could organize for fair wages. Communities with competent leadership might challenge the extraction of wealth by outside interests. Ada's medical expertise was dangerous because it offered hope for self-sufficiency. James confronted Mrs. Patterson that evening, showing her the evidence he had gathered. The elderly woman sat heavily in her kitchen chair, her face pale with recognition. "I've seen this before," she admitted quietly. 20 years ago, a teacher came to Copper Ridge. Educated man who started teaching the miners' children proper reading and arithmetic. Suddenly there was a fire at the schoolhouse. Teacher barely escaped with his life. Harrison Blackwood, his father, but same methods. They can't allow people to become too educated or healthy. Makes them harder to control. James realized the scope of what they faced. This was not just about Ada or even Copper Ridge. It was about maintaining a system that kept entire communities trapped in cycles of exploitation. The next morning, James visited Ada in her cell. She was writing detailed medical notes on scraps of paper, documenting every case she had treated and the procedures she had used. "You're gathering evidence," he observed. "I'm preparing for court," Ada replied. "Judge Morrison is honest. If I can present proper documentation of my credentials and medical results, he might listen." James showed her the financial records he had uncovered. Ada studied them with the same analytical precision she applied to medical cases. "This explains everything," she said finally. "Every town I've helped, every community that started improving, they were systematically destroyed to maintain dependence. Blackwood profits when people are sick and desperate," James continued. "Cheap labor, no organized resistance, maximum extraction of wealth with minimum investment in worker safety." Ada looked through the barred window at the mining families going about their daily routines. Children played in streets while their fathers worked in dangerous conditions for inadequate wages. Mothers struggled to maintain households on meager incomes while paying inflated prices for inferior medical care. "They're not just stealing money," Ada said. "They're stealing futures. Generations trapped in poverty because they're denied access to education, health care, and opportunity." James nodded grimly. "The question is whether we can prove it before Friday's trial." That evening, Tom Rodriguez and several other miners met secretly in the Rodriguez kitchen. They discussed what they had witnessed during Ada's public medical work and what it meant for their community. "She saved my boy's hand," Tom said quietly. "Finch would have cut it off and charged me $50 for the privilege." "She delivered my daughter safely," added Miguel Santos. "Finch said my wife would die, but Dr. Ada knew exactly what to do." The men realized they held the key to Ada's vindication. Their testimonies could prove her medical competence and expose the systematic neglect they had endured under official care. But speaking publicly meant risking their jobs, their homes, and their families' safety. Harrison Blackwood controlled their employment and could destroy their lives with a single decision. The choice between justice and survival would define not just Ada's fate, but the future of their entire community. James rode hard through the night toward the territorial capital. His horse's hooves pounded against the desert trail as he carried Ada's medical credentials and the evidence of financial corruption. The satchel of his father's money bounced against his hip, finally serving its intended purpose. In Santa Fe, James found attorney Samuel Morrison, the judge's nephew, and a man with reputation for integrity. Morrison examined Ada's Howard University diploma, her medical transcripts, and her detailed case notes from Copper Ridge. "These credentials are impeccable," Morrison said, adjusting his spectacles. "She's more qualified than most frontier doctors I've encountered." James spread the financial documents across Morrison's desk. Bank receipts, payment records, and correspondence between Sheriff Wade and Harrison Blackwood painted a clear picture of systematic corruption. "They're not just persecuting her," James explained. "They're maintaining a system that keeps entire communities sick and dependent." Morrison studied the evidence with growing concern. His legal mind connected patterns that revealed a conspiracy spanning multiple mining towns across the territory. "I'll need witness testimony to make this case in court," Morrison warned. "Documentation alone won't be sufficient." Back in Copper Ridge, the mining families gathered in secret meetings throughout the week. They met in kitchen corners and mine shaft entrances, whispering plans that could cost them everything they had worked to build. Maria Rodriguez organized the women, while Tom coordinated with the miners. They created detailed lists of every medical case Ada had handled, every life she had saved, every instance where Dr. Finch's incompetence had nearly resulted in tragedy. "She delivered my twins when Finch said they were both going to die," whispered Carmen Santos. "Now they're healthy, happy children. She set my father's broken ribs properly," added young Miguel Torres. "Finch wanted to charge $20 just to look at him." The testimonies accumulated like evidence in a murder trial. Each story revealed the systematic neglect that had characterized medical care in Copper Ridge until Ada's arrival. but speaking publicly meant confronting Harrison Blackwood's economic power. The mine owner controlled jobs, housing, and credit at the company's store. Families who challenged him faced immediate eviction and blacklisting from employment throughout the territory. Ada spent her jail time organizing medical notes and preparing her legal defense. She wrote detailed case studies documenting her treatment methods, patient outcomes, and the medical procedures she had performed during the mine collapse. Sheriff Wade visited her cell daily, trying to intimidate her into accepting exile rather than facing trial. "Judge Morrison's a reasonable man," Wade said with false friendliness. "You leave quietly, and we forget this whole medical license business." "I have a legitimate medical degree," Ada replied calmly. "I've committed no crimes." Wade's facade dropped. "You committed the crime of making important people look bad. That's dangerous in a place like this." On Thursday evening, James returned from Santa Fe with Attorney Morrison and a federal marshal named Patrick Hayes. Morrison carried official documents from the Territorial Medical Board confirming Ada's credentials. Marshal Hayes carried warrants based on the financial evidence James had uncovered. The legal team met secretly with the mining families in the abandoned church on the edge of town. Morrison explained how the trial would proceed and what testimony would be needed to expose the conspiracy. "This case is about more than medical licensing," Morrison told the assembled families. "It's about systematic corruption that has exploited your community for years." Tom Rodriguez stood up slowly, his hat in his hands. "Dr. Ada saved my brother's life during the mine collapse," he said firmly. "Saved all 12 men when Finch was too drunk to help. That's worth more than any piece of paper from the territorial capital." One by one, other mining families began sharing their stories. The testimonies painted a picture of deliberate medical neglect designed to keep the community weak and dependent. Maria Rodriguez described how Ada had delivered difficult births that Dr. Finch had abandoned. Miguel Santos explained how proper wound care had saved his leg from amputation. Carmen Torres testified about childhood fevers that Ada had treated successfully after Finch had declared them hopeless. Attorney Morrison documented every testimony, building a case that would expose the systematic exploitation of Copper Ridge's residents. Marshal Hayes reviewed the financial evidence linking Sheriff Wade and Dr. Finch to Harrison Blackwood's mining operation. The payments revealed a conspiracy to maintain inadequate medical care as a method of social control. "We have enough evidence to prosecute multiple federal crimes," Hayes announced, "but the mining families will need to testify publicly in court." The room fell silent as families contemplated the risk of challenging Blackwood's authority openly. Jobs, homes, and children's futures hung in the balance. Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house proprietor, broke the silence. "I've lived in Copper Ridge for 30 years, she said quietly. "Watched good people die from treatable conditions while bad men got rich. Maybe it's time that changed." Her courage inspired others. Families began volunteering to testify despite the economic risks. They understood that Ada's trial represented their only chance to break free from systematic exploitation. Tom Rodriguez organized a protection plan for families who testified. They would share resources and support each other if Blackwood retaliated with job losses or evictions. "We stand together or we fall separately," Tom declared. "Dr. Ada stood up for us when we needed her. Now we stand up for her." By midnight, 23 families had committed to providing testimony. Their collective voice would tell a story of medical competence versus systematic neglect, of corporate greed versus community welfare. The battle lines were drawn for Friday's trial, with truth and justice facing off against corruption and economic power in the dusty courthouse of Copper Ridge. Judge Morrison arrived at the Copper Ridge courthouse at dawn, flanked by Federal Marshal Hayes and 2 territorial deputies. The packed courtroom buzzed with tension as mining families filled every available seat. Harrison Blackwood sat in the front row, his expensive suit contrasting sharply with the work clothes surrounding him. Sheriff Wade brought Ada from her cell, expecting a quick proceeding that would result in her permanent exile. Instead, he found Attorney Morrison presenting official documentation to the judge. "Your Honor, my client holds legitimate medical credentials from Howard University," Morrison announced, placing Ada's diploma and transcripts on the court table. "The Territorial Medical Board has confirmed her qualifications." Judge Morrison examined the documents carefully. His weathered face showed no emotion as he reviewed transcripts that proved Ada's medical education exceeded that of most frontier doctors. "These credentials appear authentic and complete," the judge declared. "The defendant is qualified to practice medicine in this territory." Sheriff Wade's confident expression cracked. This was not the predetermined outcome he had expected. Attorney Morrison called his first witness. Tom Rodriguez walked to the front of the courtroom, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "Dr. Holston saved my brother's life during the mine collapse," Tom testified clearly. "Performed surgery that Dr. Finch said was impossible. My brother walks today because of her skill." Maria Rodriguez followed, describing how Ada had delivered her twins safely after Dr. Finch had declared both babies would die. Miguel Santos testified about proper wound care that had saved his leg from unnecessary amputation. Each testimony painted the same picture. Ada provided competent medical care while Dr. Finch offered expensive incompetence. The systematic neglect became undeniable as witness after witness described similar experiences. Dr. Finch squirmed in his seat as his professional failures were exposed publicly. His drinking, his misdiagnoses, his willingness to perform unnecessary procedures for financial gain all became part of the court record. Attorney Morrison then presented the financial evidence James had uncovered. Bank records showed payments from Harrison Blackwood to both Sheriff Wade and Dr. Finch that far exceeded legitimate expenses. "These documents reveal a conspiracy to maintain inadequate medical care," Morrison declared. "Systematic exploitation designed to keep this community dependent and unable to organize for better conditions." Federal Marshal Hayes took the stand to explain his investigation of the financial records. He detailed how similar patterns existed in other mining towns where Ada had worked, showing a coordinated effort to drive her away whenever her competence threatened the established system. The defendant was not practicing medicine illegally, Hayes testified. She was being systematically persecuted for practicing medicine competently. Harrison Blackwood demanded to address the court. His polished demeanor couldn't hide the desperation in his voice as he attempted to discredit the testimony. "These people are confused about what they experienced," Blackwood argued. "Dr. Finch has served this community faithfully for years." Judge Morrison studied the accumulated evidence with the careful attention of a man accustomed to separating truth from deception. The documentation was thorough, the witness testimony consistent, and the financial corruption undeniable. "Based on the evidence presented," Judge Morrison announced, "I find no grounds for the charges against Dr. Ada Holston. Her medical credentials are legitimate, and her practice has benefited this community significantly." The courtroom erupted in cheers from the mining families, but Judge Morrison was not finished. Furthermore, the evidence reveals systematic corruption that demands federal investigation. Marshal Hayes, you are authorized to arrest Harrison Blackwood, Sheriff Wade, and Dr. Finch on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and violation of territorial medical regulations. Federal deputies moved quickly to place the three men under arrest. Blackwood's protests echoed through the courthouse as he was led away in chains. Sheriff Wade's badge was removed and handed to James, who had been appointed as temporary law enforcement pending territorial review. Dr. Finch collapsed into his chair, the weight of his exposed incompetence finally destroying his fragile facade of authority. Judge Morrison addressed Ada directly as she stood before the court. "Dr. Holston, you are hereby authorized to establish a legitimate medical practice in Copper Ridge. The territorial government will provide funding for a proper clinic and medical supplies." The mining families surrounded Ada as she left the courthouse, their faces bright with hope for the first time in years. Children who had watched their parents suffer under inadequate care now looked forward to a future with proper medical attention. James used his inheritance money to purchase the building that would become Ada's medical clinic. The structure was cleaned, repaired, and equipped with proper medical facilities that reflected her professional training. 6 months later, Copper Ridge had transformed into a model mining community. Worker safety improved dramatically under James's honest law enforcement. Medical emergencies no longer resulted in preventable deaths or unnecessary amputations. Ada established a training program where she taught basic medical skills to women in the community. Her students learned proper wound care, sanitation, and emergency procedures that could save lives when professional help was unavailable. The mining operation itself became more profitable under honest management. Workers who received proper medical care missed fewer days due to illness. Families with access to competent health care invested more energy in community development rather than survival. James and Ada worked together to build a system based on competence rather than exploitation. His experience with honest leadership complemented her medical expertise to create genuine prosperity for the entire community. On a warm evening in spring, Ada stood outside her clinic watching children play safely in streets that had once echoed with the sounds of preventable suffering. James approached from his sheriff's office, carrying reports of the community's continued improvement. "Hard to believe this is the same place," he observed. Ada smiled as she watched Maria Rodriguez's healthy twins chase Tom's recovered brother through the dusty street. The boy's hand, which Dr. Finch would have amputated, threw a ball with perfect precision. "People just needed someone to believe in their worth," Ada replied. "Sometimes healing communities takes the same skills as healing individuals." The sun set over Copper Ridge, illuminating a town where dignity, competence, and justice had finally triumphed over systematic exploitation and willful ignorance.